you very much, and Bogotov to everybody here, and warm thanks to Professor Yakubov and the staff here at the Holon Institute for a very warm welcome here. I've already seen quite a lot and heard a lot about the research going on here, seen some of it in practice, fascinating. And I've also been fascinated to hear how many international contacts you have here, which is, of course, the lifeblood of science. I mean, science is a republic without borders, and international cooperation is absolutely key. And it's really nice to see that your institute is so well plugged in to this international community of science, and I think that's something that you as students here will be benefiting a lot from as well. Today I'm going to speak a little about the relationship between the EU and Israel, with particular emphasis on the relationship in science and technology. But first of all, I want to say that I think, and this is maybe contrary to the impression one can get sometimes from reading the newspapers, that the relationship, the bilateral relationship between the EU and Israel is one of the strongest relationships we have with any third country outside the EU. The bilateral relationship is spanning a very, very broad field of areas where we are cooperating and have strong mutual interests. Let me just mention a couple of examples. The European Union is Israel's biggest trading partner. We have 60 billion euro mutual trade a year, which is very, very significant and growing all the time. We have a visa-free regime which allows Europeans to visit easily Israel and allows Israelis to come quickly and relatively conveniently to Europe. We just concluded an open skies agreement about a year and a half ago, which have been driving down transport costs via air between the European continent and Israel, thus allowing for many more human contacts between Israel and Europe. And we are cooperating with the Israeli government in a whole lot of areas through the instrument of twinning, where we are twinning national administrations in the EU member states with their counterparts here in Israel in the field of statistics, environment, agriculture and rural development, thereby ensuring a free flow of best practices, capacity building from Europe to Israel. And I'm happy to say that in most instances the European counterparts are learning as much from this experience as the Israelis are, all with a view to ensuring that Israel has better access to the European internal market by adopting some of the standards and practices that are necessary in order to place goods and services on this market. But over and above all this practical cooperation, there are of course very strong bonds binding us together of our common values, our common belief in respect for human rights, democracy, rule of law, market principles, together with a long cultural affinity and a shared history. So when one looks at that, one really, I think, sees that it is a very broad-ranging and very strong relationship that we have. We like to say that the EU-Israeli scientific cooperation is really the jewel in the crown of our relations, because it's in many ways illustrative of the broader relationship. It's a real win-win situation. We both have a great deal to learn from one another, and we can each contribute to the development and the progress of one another. Our scientific cooperation has a long, and I think it's fair to say very successful history. Since 1996, Israel has been fully associated in the EU's 7-year research and development programs known as the so-called framework programs, though the newest one has an additional title. It's called Horizon 2020, and I think a lot of you are familiar with that program. That is the biggest research and development program in the world. It has a budget of some 80 billion euros for a 7-year period. And Israel is the only non-European country associated with these framework programs and with Horizon 2020, which I think is a very clear indication of the importance that both sides attaches to this cooperation, or to our cooperation in this area. Israel, of course, contributes to these framework programs budgets on an equal basis with the EU member states. It's no free lunch. I mean, one has, of course, to contribute to the program. But very quickly, Israel began to receive more funds from the framework programs than it contributed to the budget. And the latest estimate for the framework program 7 indicate that Israel receives about 1.6 shekels back from every shekel that it puts into the program, which is pretty good business. I think that you would agree. In other words, this is a huge success seen from the point of view of Israel, and I think very much testimony to the excellence of your science, because these programs are fiercely competitive, and you don't get any money out of them unless you are putting in the best projects and the most competitive projects. But, and this is very important to point out, participation in these EU framework programs is much more than euros and shekels. Through its association to the framework programs, Israel has become member of the largest public-funded research and development programs in the world. And Israel gains through that huge exposure for its academia and industry to cutting-edge research and markets. The links to leading institutions and to key actors in the private sectors are invaluable contributions to both our research worlds and to our economies. And I think that's a very important point. In fact, the Holon Institute is already part of this cooperation, as I'm sure you know, having participated in 2 FP7 projects, and I learned this morning you have actually participated all the way from the 4th framework program. And I also understand that you have submitted a number of proposals to the Horizon 2020 program, and I very much hope that you will be successful in those applications. But these are all statistics and good words, but I will try to also illustrate some of the results that are coming out of this cooperation with a few concrete examples. These are from other institutions of our scientific cooperation, which combine excellence in science with practical outcomes. My first example is Hussam Haque, who is now a full professor at the Technion. In 2006, Mr. Haque, he returned from the US to the Technion with a 1.7 million euro grant from the FP7. This grant is known as the Marie Curie Excellence Grant, and it provides promising researchers the opportunity to set up or develop their own research teams. Mr. Haig's grant was at the time the largest Marie Curie grant ever received by an Israeli researchers. His research focused on the development of a nano nose for the detection of early stages of cancer. And Professor Haig then went on to receive one of the EU's most prestigious science awards, the ERC grant, which is awarded for cutting-edge research. Under the latest EU framework program, Horizon 2020, Professor Haig is heading a consortium of 8 European universities and companies who are working on developing the sniff phone, which will enable disease detection via a system that can be attached to a smartphone. Professor Haig is also participating in another Horizon 2020 project, which is developing non-invasive breath tests to early diagnosis of tropical diseases. This, I think, is a very good example of cutting-edge technology. Another example is Professor Amir Ahmedi, who under the 7th framework program got a grant, and he's working at the Hebrew University to develop a system that teaches the blind to see through their ears. His system translates visual images into sounds that can be interpreted by blind people. Just Google Amir Ahmedi to see an amazing demonstration of this in one of his lectures. I can really recommend that. My third example is the Nation Men, which is also funded under the 7th framework program, which brought together researchers from Europe, South Africa, Israel, and Jordan to develop a simple, low-cost, user-friendly water purification system which converts contaminated water into quality drinking water using renewable energy and without using any chemicals. This is obviously something that has very, very wide application, particularly in the third world, where lack of access to portable drinking water is a major killer, as you know. You may also be interested to hear that every year, together with the EU embassies, our delegation, the EU delegation in Tel Aviv, organizes an EU-Israel innovation seminar which brings together European and Israeli experts from government, academia, and the private sector to discuss key issues in innovation. So, if any of you would like to know more about this year's seminar, which will focus on social innovation, just let us know. Finally, on science and technology, I want to underline that we are, of course, also cooperating with the Israeli Ministry of Science, Technology and Space, including for this year's Israeli National Science Day, which will take place on the 12th of May. We will be hosting a reception on the 11th of May, and I hope to work together with a number of universities to highlight our mutual scientific cooperation and our cooperation with academic institutions. So as you can see, there is a very rich agenda here on science and technology, and I haven't even touched on the Erasmus Plus program, which is also a very important mechanism for cooperation between Israel and academic institutions in Europe, providing, as it does, funding for capacity building and the development of joint teaching programs accreditation, and so on and so forth, and where Israel is quite a successful participant as well. The last point I want to make is that obviously all this wonderful cooperation that we have does not take place in a void. It doesn't take place in abstract. It's all inscribed in a relationship which is inextricably linked to what I started out by saying is the foundation of our relationship. That is our common values of respect for human rights, democratic values, and the rule of law. And therefore, the cooperation in all the areas of practical nature that I have been describing have to proceed in parallel with progress on the realization and the respect for our common values. Some people are saying, why is that necessary? Why can one not, in a way, divorce the bilateral relationship we have from various political issues on which we may disagree, be it the Israeli-Palestinian issue or be it other issues where we are not always seeing eye to eye. And I think that is something very fundamental to the European Union, and it's very important to understand that the way European Union sees itself is as a community of values. That's the basis on which we are founded, and it's the way that Europe managed to come together after the destruction of the Second World War, and something very intrinsic to our whole identity. And here, there are, of course, some issues that are of concern to Europeans when it comes to Israel, and I think you are all very well aware of them. Basically, I think that the occupation that Israel is managing of the Palestinian areas creates obviously problems in terms of human rights violation, suppression of other people, and so on and so forth. And this makes an impression in Europe. This is an area of foreign relations which are widely covered by the press in Europe and of which almost all Europeans are aware. And the point here is that European consumers and European scientists, for that matter, have a problem sort of compartmentalizing things. They are inevitably affected by these news and what they are observing on these issues as well. So even if we at a political level wanted to distinguish between politics and our bilateral relationship, it would not be possible to do in practice, because it does affect people's behavior, it does affect their willingness to pick Israeli products in the supermarket, and possibly for some scientists to participate in conferences in Israel, and so on and so forth. So therefore, it is very important, as we see it, that Israel is being seen as trying to address this issue in a consistent and credible manner. And for that reason, we think that it is very important that the new government, which is coming out of the elections that you have yesterday, and on which I would like to congratulate you, will be one that will be working seriously and consistently to try to end the occupation and get that problem solved. When and if that happens, I can tell you that the European Union will be ready to make our cooperation in science and technology sort of the standard on which we would seek to develop all other aspects of our relationship. I think it's significant that the European Union, less than a year and a half ago, made a strong commitment at the Minister of Foreign Affairs level, promising Israel a special privileged partnership, which would be the next best thing to membership of the European Union if it, together with the Palestinians, would be able to solve this problem. I think this is the big promise that our cooperation holds, and that is, I think, the direction in which we should work. So on that note, I would like to end my, my short lecture here, and I would be very ready to entertain any questions or comments that you may have. Thank you very much. But that's fine. If everything is crystal clear, then we don't.
So the question was regarding the EU reactions on elections and your personal attitude to the results of the elections.
Well, all I can say about that is that the European Union obviously respect the verdict of the Israeli voters, and we have no intention and no right whatsoever to in any way interfere in that process. I think you had very successful elections yesterday, and now everybody, and not least you, are waiting what government will come out of these elections. But I can assure you that the European Union is 100% committed to working constructively with any Israeli government, and this is what we are hoping to do. As I said before, there are numerous challenges that are facing all of us, and we stand ready to cooperate and assist and back Israel in trying to overcome those challenges that not least the region that you are situated in is posing. No, I think what I was describing is the innovation seminars. Yes, yes. It's on our website, but if you give me your particulars, I'll ensure also it can be sent to you. The idea here is it's a quite successful seminar we have had for a number of years, which is bringing people who are engaged in stimulating innovation and entrepreneurship in Europe and Israel together here in Israel to discuss various issues that are relevant to the whole question of a culture of entrepreneurship, be it financing, be it innovation incubators, issues like that. And this year it's going to be on social innovation, and it will be taking place in Tel Aviv down by the old train station. And there are normally a lot of interesting people involved, Yossi Vardi, others, and I mean, I will certainly give you information or ensure that you will get information on it. It's in September. It's in September. I can't remember. I think it's around the 12th of September, and it's a 2-day thing. Yeah, yeah. So. Yeah, please. Mm-hmm.
The European Union. So, how do you feel if the EU is objective towards Israel? Is it objective?
Well, I think the policy that we are pursuing is a balanced one. What we want to see is a two-state solution, and the reason why we want to see it is threefold. First of all, because we, in all modesty, believe that it is in the security interest of Israel to settle this conflict, both for democratic reasons and demographic reasons. Secondly, because we think that this conflict you have with the Palestinians is a key fault line in the region, which makes the solution of other conflicts more difficult. And thirdly, because we as Europeans want to see stability in the Middle East region, which is right on our doorstep, and because, again, we feel that a solution to that conflict would result in a greater degree of stability. Finally, we also have one other consideration, which is the fact that it has fallen upon us to fund the Palestinian Authority to the tune of 1 billion euros a year. And if we didn't do that, I don't know who else would do it. I mean, obviously the Japanese and the Americans are giving some too, but I mean, we're the greatest contributor to it. If we didn't pay that money, you would have to pay it. So far, I don't think Israel has been so interested in doing that. So also, in order to lessen our own economic commitment, we would like to see a solution to the problem. But that's really secondary. The key thing is that we think it's in your interest. Now, we realize, of course, that you cannot solve this conflict on your own, and we don't expect you to be able to solve it on your own. It takes two to tango, and it requires a commitment on the Palestinians as well. But that being said, we're very critical of any of the parties taking unilateral steps which are not conducive to a solution. And I think that the expansion of settlements and land grab that's taking place from the Israeli side and from Israeli settlers in the West Bank is one such unilateral step, which is bringing a solution further away rather than closer to us. I mean, take a trip yourself to the West Bank and see what's going on, and you will see that this is not conducive to a solution. So, I mean, while we don't expect you to solve the conflict on your own, we expect you to refrain from action which is not, which is undermining a solution to the problem. And I think that we are saying the same thing to the Palestinians. We are saying to them they should negotiate with you directly. They should not go to the ICC or other things that are simply distractions, and they should show flexibility, and they should show a genuine commitment to negotiations and trying to find a solution, and that it will not be in their interest just to sit around and wait and hope, for a better offer. And finally, we are saying to them, we are not going to fund them indefinitely, so they better start hurrying up. Eventually, the funds not only from us, but also from the Arab world, that's actually already happening, the US, Japan, and others, is going to dry up. And then they won't have any funding for their state-building projects. So time is of essence here. But the key point is that that the parties are not doing things that take them further away from a solution. I think this is a fairly balanced approach, if you ask me. So my answer to your question is yes. I mean, we are balanced, and we are not taking the Palestinian view as opposed to the Israeli view, or vice versa. We are trying to push for a solution and help both of you get to that solution. Absolutely none, obviously. Israel is participating in these science and technology programs on a totally equal basis. And the only criterion that's being applied, or criteria that are being applied in assessing your proposals for research are the merits of the case. I mean, there's no political interference or political considerations at all involved in that. The main thing, and that's a point that I'm making, is that the fact that you participate in the program is controversial in certain quarters of Europe. Many people in the European Parliament is asking, why should Israel participate in this? Why should Israel take away large sums of money from this program when we have serious problems with Israel when it comes to the Palestinian territories, and when they keep building settlements in spite of the fact that we are telling them not to do it? And what we are arguing from the side of the Commission and the institutions in Brussels is that Israel has been a member of these programs for many years, and they should continue being a member. It's mutually beneficial for us and for Israel. And we think basically that it's better to put carrots on the table rather than sticks on the table. That is the philosophy so far of the European Union. But what I'm saying is that it's not only what the 28 ministers who are sitting in the Foreign Affairs Council in Brussels every month, it's not only what they decide, it's not only what we as bureaucrats and civil servants in the institutions of the European Union in Brussels, what we think. It's about what the voters and the public in Europe think. And they can put tremendous pressure on their decision makers, be it politicians, be it members of the European Parliament and others, to put a spanner in the wheel of our cooperation. And this is what is slowly, I think, going to happen if we continue down the same course, or rather if Israel continues down the same course as we have seen in the past 6 years. There is a growing lack of patience in Europe with some of the issues that are described before. And therefore, what can happen and probably will happen if this unfortunate trend continues is that there will be restrictions on which programs Israel can participate in, and there will be, rather than an expansion of our cooperation, a standstill or maybe even a contraction of it. And this, I'm being very open and transparent about this fact, and it's not meant as a threat. It's an empirical observation, I would say, and that's the reason why it's so important that we try to preserve and cherish this relationship that we have. But also here, it takes two to tango, and sometimes we would wish that your government would make it a little easier for us to be able to continue to sell our very expansive cooperation with Israel to the European public, because they are the ones in the end that will have to endorse it and will have to ensure that it continues. Please. I think you have a very rich and a very vibrant and a highly skilled scientific community in this country. There's a great interest in Europe to work with Israeli scientists that are considered of a very high caliber. And I think you should cherish that. It's a very important part, as I see it, also of your innovation culture here. I think maybe the Israeli government should consider doing more to stimulate and support their scientific community. It's always a question of scarce resources and priorities and so on. But I think it's remarkable that the Horizon 2020 is actually the largest public funder of research in this country, and it's a foreign program. So I think your scientific community should keep pushing for better and more support. But I think, as I said before, that the Republic of Science has no boundaries, and obviously Israeli researchers are working not only here, but all over the world, in Europe and the US and in other places as well. And I think they are very valuable contribution to international scientific efforts and the international scientific community. Sorry, yeah?
You mentioned earlier that our cooperation will come to an end due to pressure from the European Union because of the settlements and the course the Israeli government is heading towards. But me, to suggest that the settlements are at the heart of the issue is ludicrous. And I think that if our cooperation will come to an end, it's because the exponential rise of anti-Semitism in Europe and radical Islam in Europe, and not because the course that the Israeli government is going towards. What is your response?
My response is twofold. I think, without going into details, I mean, there is an international consensus which has also been endorsed by the UN Security Council that what we are aiming for is a Palestinian state within, outside the 67 lines. This is what we are trying to achieve. That's what various Israeli governments have committed themselves to in negotiations and so on and so forth. And therefore, attempts to start encroaching on this area, which is supposed to be an independent Palestinian state, is obviously very problematic, because it's a little akin to two people trying to slice up or negotiate how to divide a cake, and then one of the parties sitting eating of the cake while the negotiations are going on, and creating what is being termed as facts on the ground. Obviously, the big settlement blocks on the Green Line are now by everybody considered to be part of Israel and going to be part of Israel in any future agreement, which is understandable, but it shows that Israel, by building in these settlement blocks, have actually been able to grab an extra piece of that territory, which is still up for negotiations, and therefore, as long as the negotiations are not finished, I mean, you cannot start eating the cake and encroaching on the territory. That's how it's seen in Europe. It's seen as very unfair and unreasonable, and that's the reason why people react. Anti-Semitism is something very, very different. It's something which is utterly repulsive, and something which we condemn unreservedly, and something which is in fact totally anti-European. We in Europe, I think, are becoming increasingly aware of the phenomenon of anti-Semitism, which, as you rightly point out, has been on the rise. And I think what is happening now is that we are taking a number of measures in order to curb that phenomenon. Also, the phenomenon has spread beyond the Jewish community. As you know, in Denmark, for example, there was a Jewish guard killed at the synagogue. There was also a participant in an event concerning freedom of speech and freedom of religion that was killed. And I think it's part and parcel of the same phenomenon of intolerance towards other people's views, attempts to suppress people's right to religion and right to freedom of speech, fanaticism, and racism. I think that we are now making a common front against this threat, and it has many different dimensions. It has security dimensions. If you come to Europe, you will see in France and Belgium and other places many more soldiers on the street that I've ever seen before. I mean, because there basically were none before. Guarding of various exposed places, including synagogues, but also newspapers and other places where freedom of expression is being practiced. You see a very conscious effort on part of European governments and also the Brussels institutions to try to work together with internet providers, cracking down on anti-Semitism, incitement, racism on the internet, because 70 or 80% of anti-Semitism and incitement against Jews are really carried through the internet. So it's an absolutely vital media to somehow patrol. And the providers are, by the way, being very receptive and very responsive in closing down some of these sites. Then they pop up again in other places, but then they are closed down again. And we also need to develop a counter-narrative, I think, on the internet. So all these wild people, fanatical Muslims and others who are spreading this hate speech and incitement on the internet are met with a counter-narrative that is telling a different story, and also pointing out that this is totally at odds with some of the key values of Islam. So it's a very broad-faceted fight that we are going into here, but I think that anti-Semitism is definitely a key element in trying to confront this problem, and I think there's a growing realization in Europe that we need to do something serious about this. So in that sense, but that being said, I also want to say that there is a difference between anti-Semitism, which is inexcusable in my opinion, and then legitimate criticism and disagreement with policies of governments. And one should never confuse the two and say that any criticism equals anti-Semitism. And there is a tendency sometimes, even in political circles here, not to make that distinction. And I think that's very, very dangerous, because it trivializes, in my opinion, anti-Semitism.
So I'd like to thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. For me, it's very...